Chapter 24. Wallace Joins the Fray, Part 4. The battle echoed across the city ruins, the sounds of clashing metal and the furious roars of the Disciple of Earth creating a symphony of chaos. From his vantage point at the cult's HQ, Wallace leaned heavily on the windowsill, his sharp eyes tracking the movement of Mina, Thomas, and Lucas through the broken streets. His knuckles tightened against the frame as he watched Mina rush headlong after the retreating disciple, her fiery determination cutting through his calculated thoughts like a blade. "Mina, you reckless fool," he muttered under his breath. He couldn't deny her skill or resolve, but Wallace knew better than anyone how desperation could cloud judgment. Even as he witnessed her precision strikes keeping the disciple off balance, he saw the inherent danger. She was pushing too hard, too fast, and leaving herself vulnerable. She doesn't see it. She's too focused. Wallace said to no one in particular. It was then that he made his decision. His place was no longer at the HQ. Strategies and plans could only do so much from afar. Without waiting for approval or second-guessing his instinct, Wallace grabbed his gear and headed out, his mind racing through the fastest route to join the fray. The streets were treacherous. Rubble and debris turned every step into a gamble, but Wallace's years of training carried him swiftly through the chaos. His mind, ever sharp, calculated each turn and obstacle with precision, though his chest tightened with every distant clash he heard. As he neared the battlefield, the scene unfolded before him like a grim painting. Mina darted through the ruins, her movements a blur as she baited the disciple toward her. Thomas, his shield battered but still held firm, coordinated the militia to block any escape routes. Lucas, visibly pale and exhausted, staggered after them, his hands trembling as he leaned against a crumbling wall. "Mina!" Wallace bellowed as he closed the gap. His voice cut through the cacophony, a commanding tone that made even the disciple momentarily glance in his direction. Mina turned briefly, her expression a mix of frustration and relief. "What are you doing here?" she shouted back, leaping to avoid a swipe from the disciple's molten claws. "Saving you from yourself!" Wallace snapped as he unsheathed his blade, a sturdy weapon that gleamed even in the dim light. Without hesitation, he charged forward, using the element of surprise to land a decisive strike against the disciple's leg. The blow didn't pierce the rocky surface, but it disrupted the creature's stance, forcing it to stagger. Thomas seized the moment, signaling the militia to press forward and block the disciple's escape. Lucas, still catching his breath, felt a surge of relief at Wallace's arrival. "Wallace," he said telepathically, his voice weak but laced with gratitude. "Thank you." Wallace didn't respond immediately. His focus was entirely on the battle, his movements precise as he weaved around the disciple's lumbering strikes. Despite his age and lack of magical abilities, Wallace's tactical mind and disciplined training made him an invaluable asset. "Lucas," Wallace finally responded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Save your energy. You'll need it for what's coming next." Lucas nodded weakly, his hand gripping a jagged piece of rubble for support. He couldn't afford to collapse. Not yet. Mina and Wallace needed him, and the fight was far from over. The disciple roared, its molten core glowing brighter as it unleashed a shockwave that sent rubble flying in all directions. Wallace shielded his eyes, gritting his teeth as the force pushed him back. "Hold the line." He barked to Thomas and the militia, his voice carrying an authority that reignited their resolve. Mina, undeterred, lunged back into the fray, her kicks landing with devastating precision. Each strike chipped away at the disciple's defenses, forcing it to reevaluate its strategy. Wallace, noticing the subtle shifts in the disciple's movements, called out, "It's adapting. Mina, don't overcommit." But Mina's determination burned too brightly. She wasn't ready to retreat, not when they had the upper hand. As the disciple's molten core flickered erratically, Wallace saw an opening. "Now!" he shouted, leading a coordinated attack with the militia. Together, they pushed the disciple to its limits, but Wallace's instincts told him this battle wasn't over yet. And he was right. The disciple's next move would test them all. The disciple of Earth's molten core pulsed like a living furnace, casting an eerie glow across the shattered ruins. Wallace gripped his sword tighter, his knuckles white, as he analyzed the shifting movements of their monstrous opponent. Mina, unrelenting, darted around the disciple, her strikes chipping at its hardened form, but not enough to bring it down. "We can't keep this up forever," Thomas shouted, his shield absorbing another devastating blow. The impact sent him skidding back, his boots carving tracks in the dust. Lucas, leaning heavily against a jagged wall, struggled to focus. His exhaustion was a vice tightening around his mind, but he couldn't let himself falter. Not when Mina was still fighting, her agility unmatched as she danced out of reach of the disciple's molten claws. "Mina, fall back," Wallace barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "No," she snapped, her green eyes blazing. She landed another kick against the disciple's knee, forcing it to stumble. "We're wearing it down." Wallace clenched his jaw. "Not fast enough." The disciple roared, slamming its fists into the ground. A shockwave rippled outward, cracking the earth and sending debris flying. Mina leaped to avoid the worst of it, but a jagged piece of stone grazed her shoulder. She winced, ignoring the pain as she steadied herself. Wallace's tactical mind raced as he observed the battlefield. The militia, though courageous, was scattered and struggling to make an impact. Thomas was doing his best to rally them, but their weapons barely scratched the disciples' hardened exterior. "Lucas," Wallace shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "Any brilliant ideas?" Lucas wiped sweat from his brow, his chest heaving. He racked his brain for a solution, but his earlier use of thermal manipulation had drained him too much to attempt it again. I don't know. I need more time." "We don't have time," Wallace growled, charging back into the fray. His sword glinted in the dim light as he slashed at the disciple's torso. The blade glanced off the molten rock, but the force of his strike disrupted the creature's balance. Mina seized the opportunity, launching another powerful kick that connected with the disciple's side. This time, the blow left a visible crack in its rocky shell. "It's working," Mina yelled, her voice laced with adrenaline. "Don't get cocky," Wallace warned, circling around the disciple to draw its attention. "Keep it focused, but don't overextend." The disciple, visibly shaken but far from defeated, retaliated with renewed ferocity. Its molten claws swung in wide arcs, forcing Wallace and Mina to retreat momentarily. Thomas and the militia closed ranks, creating a barrier to protect Lucas as he tried to recover. But the disciple wasn't slowing down. With a guttural roar, it slammed its fist into the ground again, this time summoning jagged spikes of earth that shot upward like spears. One of them caught Wallace off guard, striking his side and sending him crashing to the ground. "Wallace!" Mina screamed, her heart lurching as she saw him fall. She bolted toward him, ducking and weaving to avoid the disciple's relentless attacks. Lucas's panic surged through their telepathic link. "Mina, stay back, don't—" "He's hurt!" Mina shot back, her thoughts sharp with determination. Reaching Wallace, she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his wound. The jagged spike had pierced his side, blood staining his cloak. Wallace gritted his teeth, his face pale but his eyes still sharp. "Don't waste time," he rasped. "Get everyone out of here. Regroup." Mina shook her head. "No, we're not leaving you." Thomas arrived, shield raised as he blocked an incoming attack. "She's right. We're not retreating, not without you." Lucas, seeing Wallace's injury, forced himself to his feet. His legs felt like lead, but he couldn't let the others carry this alone. Drawing on the last reserves of his strength, he shouted telepathically to Mina, Thomas, and the militia. "We have to fall back. Regroup. This isn't over, but we can't win like this." Mina hesitated, her fists clenched as she looked at the disciple, still advancing despite its visible damage. But Wallace's strained voice broke through her thoughts. "He's right," Wallace said weakly. "Live to fight another day." With great effort, Mina and Thomas helped Wallace to his feet. The militia closed ranks, creating a defensive perimeter as they began to retreat. The disciple, though shaken, let out a guttural growl and didn't pursue. For now. As they retreated, Lucas's exhaustion weighed on him heavily, but he vowed silently to find another way to stop the disciple. They hadn't lost. This was only the beginning. The group's retreat through the ruined streets was tense, every step heavy with the weight of failure. Lucas, Mina, Thomas, and Wallace, supported by the battered militia, moved toward a makeshift safe zone deep within the city's labyrinthine alleys. Wallace leaned heavily on Thomas, blood seeping through his cloak, his breath shallow but steady. Mina glanced back, her sharp green eyes scanning for any sign of the disciple. Despite its earlier relentlessness, it hadn't pursued them, but she knew better than to let her guard down. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice low but laced with determination. Lucas stumbled, barely catching himself on the jagged edge of a broken wall. His vision blurred with exhaustion, but he forced himself onward. Mina reached out to steady him, her touch grounding him as their telepathic link hummed faintly in the background. "You can't push yourself like this," she thought, her worry bleeding into the connection. "I don't have a choice," Lucas replied, his mental voice strained. "We need a new plan, something that works." The safe zone was a crumbling courtyard sheltered by the remains of a collapsed building. The militia set up a hasty perimeter, their faces grim as they assessed their dwindling supplies and mounting injuries. Wallace sat against a piece of rubble, his face pale but his gaze unwavering. "We're not winning this fight," he said bluntly, addressing the group. "Not with brute force." "We know," Thomas said, kneeling beside him to check his wound. "But we need to slow it down, buy time for reinforcements, if they're even coming." Mina paced the courtyard, her fists clenched. "It's not just about time. That thing isn't invincible. We hurt it. Barely. But we did. If we can find a weak point, something it can't recover from." She trailed off, her frustration evident. Lucas, sitting cross-legged nearby, closed his eyes and tried to center himself. The earlier plan to exploit thermal shock had worked to an extent, but the disciple's resilience was terrifying. Even now, his fire magic felt like a dull ember, drained from overuse. "Mina's right," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need a strategy that doesn't rely on raw power. Something precise." Wallace coughed, drawing their attention. Its movements were slower toward the end. "It's not just magic keeping it going. And that body of molten rock. It's taking damage. If we can focus on the cracks." Lucas opened his eyes, an idea sparking in his mind. "The core. We need to get close enough to target its core directly. Everything else is armor. It can heal that, but the core is where it's vulnerable." Thomas frowned, his broad shoulders tense. "Getting close enough will be a problem. Even Mina couldn't dodge everything, and Wallace—" He glanced at the older warrior, guilt flashing across his face. "I'll manage," Wallace said gruffly, though his pained expression betrayed him. "This fight isn't just yours, Thomas. I still have some strength left." "No," Mina interjected firmly. "You've done enough. We're not losing you too." Wallace gave her a faint smile. "You sound like a leader." She ignored the comment, turning to Lucas. "If you can guide us, give us the opening we need to hit the core, we might stand a chance. But you're running on fumes. Can you even manage it?" Lucas hesitated, the weight of her words pressing on him. "I'll try," he said finally. "I don't think we have another choice." As they finalized their plan, a distant rumble echoed through the city. The disciples' molten glow illuminated the horizon, drawing closer once more. Lucas took a shaky breath, his heart pounding. "This is it," he said, standing with Mina's help. "If this doesn't work—" "It will," Mina interrupted, her voice steady. She looked at him, her green eyes filled with unwavering resolve. "We'll make it work." The group moved back toward the battlefield, their exhaustion overshadowed by a shared determination. As the disciple came into view, its molten form pulsing with power, Lucas reached out telepathically to his companions. "Stay together. Watch for openings. We're going to end this." The disciple roared, its massive frame advancing with renewed aggression. But this time the group didn't falter. They had a plan, and despite the odds, they were ready to see it through.